The boots were the first thing people noticed about Casey Mercer. Not because they were fancy, they were the opposite of fancy. Steel-toed, scarred brown leather, resold twice at the cobbler on Fifth Street laces, replaced so many times the new ones still looked wrong against the worn tongue. She wore them every shift 6 days a week, 11 years running across the cracked linoleum floor of the Silver Spoon Diner in Harlow, Montana. The regulars noticed the boots because of the sound they made. A steady, unhurried rhythm. Coffee pot in the right hand. Order pad in the left. 3 tables, 4 tables, 6 tables on a busy Saturday. The boots never slowed down, never shuffled, never dragged even at the end of a double shift when the kitchen had been backed up since noon and the corner booth had been camping for 2 hours on one shared slice of pie. Casey Mercer, 34 years old, moved like a woman who had learned a long time ago that stillness was a luxury she could not afford. She was beautiful in the way that women who work hard and sleep little sometimes become beautiful, not in spite of the tiredness, but because of what it carves into a face. High cheekbones, a jaw that sat firm and straight, dark auburn hair she kept pulled back in a braid during shifts, the kind of red that looked almost brown in low light and caught the afternoon sun through the diner window like a struck match. Eyes the color of a river in late summer green with something deeper underneath. She was not a woman who thought about her own face. She thought about the coffee temperature. She thought about whether table 7 needed more water. She thought about whether the drawer was going to come up short again tonight and whether the landlord had already sent the 3rd notice or was still on the 2nd. Harlow was a small town, the kind of small that people outside of Montana imagine when they close their eyes and try to picture the word remote. One main road, a gas station, a hardware store that had been in the same family since 1958, a post office that doubled as the informal town message board, a bar called Roosters that had a neon sign with the R burned out, so it just said Oosters in pink light every night from 6 to 2, and the Silver Spoon which had been there since 1974 and smelled like it. Casey had not planned to spend 11 years in this diner. She had not planned most of what her life had become because planning requires a future you can see clearly, and for a long stretch of Casey Mercer's adult life, the future had been obscured entirely by the present. She had started at the Silver Spoon and when she was 23, the summer she came home from her 2nd year at the University of Montana in Missoula. She had been studying environmental science. She had a scholarship. She had a roommate named Patricia who wanted to drive to Portland after graduation. She had a professor who told her she had a sharp mind and should consider graduate school. Then her mother called. The word cancer does not land the same way twice. The first time Casey's mother, Donna Mercer, said it over the phone, Casey had written it down on the back of a grocery receipt like she needed to see the letters arranged in order to believe them. Lung cancer. Stage 2, the doctor had said, which sounded better than stage 3, until Casey spent 4 hours reading medical journals in the university library and understood that stage 2 still meant what it meant. She drove home the next weekend. She told her mother she was just visiting. She helped Donna schedule the first round of chemotherapy. She called the university on Monday and requested a leave of absence. The leave of absence lasted 8 years. 8 years of 6 a.m. shifts and double shifts and covering for people who called in sick. 8 years of learning which customers wanted their coffee, black, and which ones wanted it light, and which ones would complain either way just to have something to say. 8 years of driving her mother to treatment, appointments in Missoula, 3 hours round trip, on her days off with the truck's heater broken for one entire winter because she could not afford to fix it and also keep the lights on. She did not regret it. That was the thing people seemed to expect her to say, that she had sacrificed her future and felt the weight of that sacrifice pressing down on her like something she was owed. But Casey did not think about it in those terms. Donna Mercer had raised her alone from the time Casey was 6 years old, had worked every odd job and side job and thankless job a woman could find in rural Montana, had put food on the table and gas in the truck and a library card in Casey's hand before she could read the words on the front of it. Casey came home because it was not a choice. It was just what you did. Donna had been a quiet woman in the way that still water is quiet, not empty, but deep and very still at the surface. She wore her gray hair short after the chemo, and she never grew it back long afterward. She sat on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee and watched the hills and did not feel the need to fill the silence. She had a tattoo on her right forearm that she never explained, a small set of wings with a number 7 underneath, faded now to a soft blue-gray. She kept a photograph on the mantle of herself at what looked like a racetrack, young and grinning, goggles pushed up on her forehead, leaning against a motorcycle that Casey had never seen in real life. Casey had asked about the photograph exactly once when she was 12. Donna had looked at it for a long moment and said that was a long time ago. And then she had gone back to whatever she was doing, and Casey had understood without being told that the door was closed on that particular room. There were other closed rooms in Donna Mercer's life. Casey had grown up learning their shapes without ever seeing inside them. Donna died on a Tuesday in February, quietly in the bedroom of the small house on Calvert Street that she had rented for 30 years. Casey was in the chair beside the bed. The hospice nurse had stepped out for 20 minutes. It was just the two of them when it happened, which Casey believed was not an accident. The funeral was small, 14 people in the church, a few neighbors, a woman from the library where Donna had volunteered on Thursdays, the man who ran the hardware store, who had plowed Donna's driveway every winter for 15 years without being asked and without accepting payment, and 6 motorcycles in the church parking lot. Casey had not known who called them. She did not know any of them by name. They were men and women in leather, ranging in age from what looked like late 30s to at least 65, and they stood at the back of the church during the service with their helmets under their arms and their heads bowed, and afterward they filed past the casket one by one without speaking. One of them, a large man with a scarred left eyebrow and gray in his beard, paused at the casket longer than the others. He stood there with his hand resting on the edge of the wood, not touching Donna, but near her, and Casey watched his jaw work once like he was saying something nobody could hear. Then he turned. He looked at Casey across the room. He nodded once, a single slow dip of his chin, and then he walked out with the others. That was the first time Casey Mercer looked into the face of Rex Gallagher. The second was 4 days later in the lawyer's office on Main Street. The lawyer's name was Howard Briggs. He was 68 years old and had handled the legal affairs of half of Harlow for 4 decades. He sat behind a desk that was buried in paper and read from Donna's will in a voice that sounded like gravel shifting in a can. There was not much. The house was rented, so there was no house. The truck was old and worth less than the remaining loan. There was a savings account with $912. There was a box of personal effects. And there was one other item. Howard Briggs reached into his desk drawer and produced an envelope, plain white, Casey's name written on the front in her mother's handwriting, which was small and precise, and slanted slightly to the right. Inside the envelope was a key, Brassel, the kind of key that belonged to a padlock rather than a door. The teeth were still sharp. The metal had darkened with years, but was solid in the hand, heavy in a way that felt intentional. There was also a folded piece of paper. Casey unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting again. One sentence. Don't open it until you have nothing left to lose. Casey read it twice. She looked at the key. She looked at Howard Briggs. He shrugged carefully, the way lawyers shrug when they know something, but are not required to say it. There is also a property, he said, small parcel outside of town about 4 miles north on Decker Road. Your mother owned it outright. She has been paying the county property tax on it every year since 2007. He paused. There is a structure on it. A garage. What kind of garage? Casey asked. Concrete block. Steel door. He looked at his notes. No utilities connected. No recorded use. She said in the will that the contents are yours entirely. He cleared his throat once. She said to tell you that you will know when it is time. Casey put the key in her jacket pocket. She carried it home. That night, she stood in her mother's kitchen and held it in her palm for a long time, turning it over, feeling the weight of it, and then she put it on a chain and hung it around her neck where she could feel it against her sternum when she breathed. She wore it to work the next morning. That was 3 months ago. The silver spoon on a Thursday evening is what it always was. A dozen tables, half of them full. The Hendersons in the corner booth they had occupied every Thursday for 22 years. Old Pete Sallow at the counter with his decaf and his crossword. The younger men from the Callaway Ranch who came in after the late feed. Mud still on their boots, ordering the same thing they always ordered: steak plate and a side of biscuits pie if the cherry was available. Brett Holden owned the Silver Spoon. He had bought it from the original family in 2019, and immediately remodeled the sign and raised the prices and taken all the old photographs off the walls and replaced them with stock prints of mountain landscapes that had nothing to do with Harlow or Montana or any particular place on earth. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the look of a man who had once been athletic and was now soft in a way he had not yet acknowledged to himself. He wore collared shirts with the top button undone and smelled like a cologne that was more expensive than it should have been for a man running a diner in a town of 2,000 people. Casey had worked for Brett Holden for 5 years before she started understanding what he was. Not all at once. It came in small pieces, the way understanding usually does when you are too tired to look straight at something and you only catch it in the corner of your eye. The way he stood too close when he reviewed the till at the end of the night. The way he found reasons to keep her late when the other staff had already gone home. The comments that were not quite comments, phrased as jokes, said quietly enough that there was no one else who could confirm they had been said. She had handled it the way women in her position handle it. She kept her face neutral. She kept the boots moving. She did not engage and she did not escalate because she needed the job, and the job was in a town where there were not many jobs, and the math of the situation was not complicated, even when the situation itself was. She had not told her mother. Donna was sick by then, and later Donna was dying, and some things you protect the people you love from because the weight of carrying it yourself is less than the weight of watching them carry it for you. On the Thursday evening, that changed everything. The Silver Spoon had a table it did not usually have. A woman came in alone at 6:15. She was somewhere in her late 70s, small-framed, white-haired, wearing a coat that had seen better years, and carrying a purse that was held closed with a safety pin because the clasp had broken and nobody had fixed it yet. She sat down at table 4 and opened the menu and studied it with the seriousness of a person for whom ordering in a restaurant is not a casual thing. Casey brought her water and took her order. The woman wanted the soup and a side of cornbread and a glass of milk. She said thank you twice, once when Casey wrote it down, and once when she walked away, and both times she meant it. Brett Holden walked out of the back at 6:40. Casey was refilling the Henderson table's coffee when she heard his voice across the room louder than it needed to be. He was standing at table 4. The old woman had her soup in front of her and was eating it carefully the way you eat when you are hungry, but were raised to eat slowly so no one would know how hungry you are. Brett's voice carried the particular tone he used when he wanted an audience. He was telling the old woman that the Thursday evening special required a minimum order of $12, and her order of soup and cornbread came to $7.50, and that if she could not meet the minimum, she would need to either order more or vacate the table, as he had other customers waiting. There were no other customers waiting. Every table in the Silver Spoon had people at it, none of them waiting for anything except for Brett Holden to stop talking. Casey set the coffee pot down. She walked to table 4. She stood beside the old woman's chair and looked at Brett Holden, and said quietly, "There is no Thursday minimum. There has never been a Thursday minimum. I have worked here 11 years and that policy does not exist." Brett looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not anger exactly, but was what lives next to anger. He said, "Casey, this is not your concern. She said she ordered $7.50 worth of food and she is eating it. This is her table for as long as she wants it." The diner had gone quiet in the way that enclosed spaces go quiet when something real is happening in them. Old Pete Sallow had put down his pen. The Callaway Ranch hands had stopped chewing. Brett said her name again. Lower this time. She looked at him and did not move. What happened next was quick and public and could not be taken back. He told her to remove her apron. He told her to take her things from the back and be out of the building in 10 minutes. He used the word fired specifically loudly in a room full of people who had known Casey Mercer for most of her life. Casey stood still for 3 seconds. Then she reached behind her back and untied the apron strings with both hands. She folded the apron in half. She set it on the counter beside the register. She picked up her jacket from the hook by the back hallway. She stopped at the door. She turned back. She looked at the old woman at table 4, whose hand was shaking slightly above her soup spoon. "Finish your meal," Casey said. "Take your time." Then she walked out. The October night came at her like a wall of cold air. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the Silver Spoon with her jacket half on and her hands not quite steady, and the chipped paint of the diner's exterior sign lit up yellow above her head. She breathed. She drove to the apartment on Sycamore Street that she had rented for 9 years, a second-floor unit above the old insurance office that had become a seasonal gift shop that was always just about to close and somehow never did. She had paid rent here every month without missing 9 years of first-of-the-month envelopes slid under the building manager's door. The key did not work. She tried it twice. She looked at it. She tried it a third time. She went around to the alley and looked up at her windows. The lights were off. There was a notice taped to the back door, white paper folded, once her name written on the outside, and handwriting she did not recognize. She opened it. The building had been sold. She had received a 30-day notice in September, which was true. She had received it, she had read it, and she had believed she had until November 3rd. The notice in her hand said the new owner had accelerated the timeline under a provision in the purchase agreement that she had not, in her exhaustion and her grief and her 11 years of working doubles and driving her mother to chemotherapy, fully processed when she signed the renewal lease in the spring. It was October 21st. She stood in the alley beside the locked building that had been her home for 9 years and looked at the notice and looked at the key in her hand and then looked up at the sky above the roofline where a few stars were starting to show through the cloud cover. She thought about what her mother had said 3 weeks before the end, when Donna was still talking, still herself, still the woman who sat on the porch and watched the hills with her coffee. Casey had been sitting beside the bed, and Donna had looked at her for a long time without saying anything. And then she had said, "I did not leave you with nothing. You need to know that. Whatever it looks like right now, I did not leave you with nothing." Casey had squeezed her mother's hand and said she knew that because it seemed like what her mother needed to hear. She had not known what Donna meant. Standing in the alley with a useless key in her hand and no job and no apartment and $91 in her checking account, she was beginning to understand that her mother had meant it literally. She sat down on the concrete step at the base of the back door. She put her jacket all the way on. She was working through the inventory of her situation item by item when the headlights swept across the alley entrance. The motorcycle was a big one, a Road King dark paint that held the light rather than throwing it back. It slowed at the alley entrance and stopped. The rider put a boot down. The engine idled for a moment and then cut. Rex Gallagher swung off the bike and walked into the alley. He was a large man, 6'2" at least wide through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of build that comes from decades of physical work. His beard was gray and close cut. The scar through his left eyebrow caught the alley light as a thin, pale line. He wore a leather jacket with patches and boots that had been resoled more than once. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the notice in her hand. He looked at the locked door. He did not ask what happened. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. He held it out. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said, "Motel on Route 9, the High Line. Rooms paid for a week. Keys in there." She did not take it immediately. He said, "There is also some cash. It is not charity." He paused. "Your mother pulled my brother out of a ditch off Route 12 in the winter of 2003. His bike had gone down on black ice. He was bleeding, and it was 11 at night, and there was nobody on that road." She stopped. She stayed with him until the ambulance came. She would not leave. He paused again, longer this time. He had a head injury. The doctor said if he had been alone another 20 minutes, he would have died from the cold, if not the injury. Casey looked at the envelope. Rex said, "I have been paying for 2 people's coffee at that diner for 6 years because I knew you worked there, and I knew who your mother was. I tried to find a way to say it to her directly. I never did. When she passed, I thought the debt was gone. Then I saw you sitting here." Casey took the envelope. She said, "I don't know your name." "Rex Gallagher," he said. "Iron Verdict, MC, Montana, chapter out of Harlow." She nodded. "Casey Mercer," she said, even though he already knew. He said, "I know who you are." There was a silence between them. Not uncomfortable, the kind that settles when 2 people have told each other something true and are letting it stand. She said, "How did you know I was here?" "Harlow is a small town," he said. She almost smiled. That was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about Harlow, Montana. He walked back to the Road King. He kicked it over and let it idle his boot on the ground And then he looked back at her once. There was also a note in there, he said, "From me. Read it when you get settled." Then he rode out of the alley and the dark closed back in. The Highline Motel on Route 9 was clean, which was what mattered. One queen bed, a small bathroom, a table with two chairs under a window that looked out at the highway. Casey put her bag on the bed and sat down and opened the envelope. The motel key was there. The cash, which she counted once and did not count again. And a folded piece of paper. Rex's handwriting was large and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who did not write by hand often and was taking it seriously. It said, "Your mother came to our chapter meeting in 2009. She brought a box of tools she said she did not need anymore. She said she had gotten them from a woman who did not need them either. The tools are still in our shop. They are yours if you want them. But I think you already have what you need." Casey read it twice. She thought about the tools. She thought about her mother bringing a bottle of tools to a motorcycle club meeting in 2009, the year Casey was a senior in high school, the year everything had seemed briefly and incorrectly like it was going to be fine. She put the note on the table. She reached up and felt for the key at her throat. Still there. She lay back on the bed and looked at the water stain on the motel ceiling and thought about what her mother had said. "I did not leave you with nothing." She thought about the garage on Decker Road that she had driven past exactly twice in her life, both times at speed, and registered as just another concrete block structure going gray at the edges. She thought about the key. She thought about the instruction. Don't open it until you have nothing left to lose. She was unemployed. She was effectively homeless, sleeping in a motel room paid for by a man she had met 3 times. She had $91 in a truck that needed a new alternator and a jacket that was not warm enough for a Montana November. The conditions had been met. She got up at 5:30 in the morning. She showered, dressed, put her boots on. She drank the bad coffee from the motel machine and stood at the window and watched the early trucks on Route 9 move through the gray pre-dawn. She got in the truck at 6. Decker Road ran north out of Harlow for 4 miles before it curved east toward the county line. The dirt track she had never paid attention to was exactly where the deed coordinates put it. She pulled in and killed the engine. The garage was concrete block, steel door painted white once, and now mostly gray. No windows. Roughly 20 by 40 feet, built solid and close to the ground with a poured concrete pad extending in front of the door. Whatever Donna had paid to keep the property tax current, she had paid it for a building that had not fallen down. Casey got out. The morning was cold enough that her breath showed. She walked to the door. The padlock was an old master lock, heavy brass body. She held it in her hand and then reached up and took the chain from around her neck. The key fit. It turned on the first try. The hasp dropped away. She set the padlock on the concrete pad. She put both hands on the door handle and pulled. The hinges screamed. A wall of cool, dry air came with it, air that had been sealed in this building for 18 years, carrying the smell of oil and metal, and something older underneath, something she could not name, but recognized without knowing why. She found the breaker box on the right side wall and threw the main switch. The fluorescent tubes woke up one by one, cold white light, filling the garage in stages. Casey Mercer stood in the doorway and did not move for a very long time. The walls were covered. Wooden shelves bolted directly into the concrete block. On the shelves, trophies, dozens of them. Brass and silver, some taller than her forearm, some no bigger than her fist, engraved plates gone dark with years, but still readable in the fluorescent light. First place, Women's Class A Dirt Track, Billings, Montana, 1988. National Qualifier Women's Open Class, Rapid City, 1989. Season Champion AMA Regional Circuit Women's Division, 1991. She walked along the wall. She read each one. Her mouth was open and she did not know it. The back wall was photographs, black and white, and color framed and unframed, tacked and taped. A young woman in leathers and goggles with a grin that Casey recognized the shape of, even though she had not seen it often enough. The same young woman at full lean on a dirt oval, the rear tire kicking up a rooster tail of dust. The same woman accepting a trophy nearly as tall as she was from a man in a suit while a crowd surged behind her. Donna Mercer, young, fierce, victorious, her mother. Casey walked to the center of the garage. There was a motorcycle there covered with a canvas tarp. She took the edge of the canvas and pulled. The tarp slid off in one motion. The motorcycle underneath was a 1941 Indian chief. She knew what it was the moment she saw it. The paint was deep red, the color of dried roses, and it had not faded because it had lived in sealed darkness for 18 years, and before that had been cared for the way you care for something irreplaceable. The chrome was perfect. The leather saddle was cracked along one seam but intact. The tank bore a hand-painted number in a circle white paint on red. The number 7. The same 7 as the tattoo on her mother's forearm that Donna had never explained. Casey put her hand on the seat. The leather was cool and dry. She stood with her hand on the seat of her dead mother's motorcycle and looked at the trophies and the photographs and felt something move through her that was not grief exactly and not anger exactly and not wonder exactly, but was all three pressing against the inside of her chest like something that needed more room than she had. On the workbench against the far wall beside a set of carburetor tools, laid out in order on a clean cloth, was a wooden box. Plain and unfinished, no bigger than a bread box. She opened it. Inside, a journal bound in dark green canvas, a stack of folded papers, a racing patch red and white shaped like a shield, and an envelope with her name on it, her mother's handwriting. She sat down on the workbench and opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated November of the previous year, 3 months before Donna died. The handwriting was slightly less precise than it used to be, a tremor in the longer strokes, but clear. Casey, it began. If you are reading this, it is because you finally have nothing left to lose. I am sorry it took that. I hoped it would not. But I always knew it might, because the Mercer women have never been easy on themselves. And I was not able to change that in you any more than my mother was able to change it in me. I want to tell you who I was before I was your mother. I was not ready to tell you while I was alive. I am telling you now because you deserve to know, and because what I left in this garage belongs to you, and you cannot use it properly if you do not understand what it cost to build it. I raced motorcycles from 1986 to 1994. 8 years. I was good. Not good the way you say it to be polite. I was the best woman rider in the AMA regional circuit for 3 consecutive seasons. I won the 1991 national qualifier. I should have gone to the nationals. I did not go to the nationals because a man named Harold Voss made sure I did not. He owned the regional sanctioning body. He controlled the licensing board. In 1994, he found a way to disqualify my 1991 win on a paperwork technicality that did not exist when the race was run and was invented after the fact. He stripped the title. He revoked my competition license. The appeal process cost me everything I had saved, and when I ran out of money to fight it, the process ended. I never raced again. Harold Voss died in 2011. His son Dale Voss runs the development company now, and he is his father's son in every way that matters. He knows about this garage. His father spent 20 years looking for it. Now Dale is looking for it. He will come. When he comes, you need to be ready. Everything in this garage is yours. Use it well. But the Indian stays. She is not a thing to be sold. She is who I was. She is who you come from. I love you, and I am sorry I was not better at saying it. Mom. Casey sat on the workbench in the cold fluorescent light and held the letter in both hands. She read it once. She read it again. She looked at the trophies on the wall, her mother's name on every one of them, and she thought about the 8 years she had spent driving Donna to chemotherapy, 3 hours a round trip in the broken truck, the heater that would not work, her mother sitting in the passenger seat with her eyes closed and her hands in her lap, not talking, both of them looking at the same road. She thought about all the rooms with closed doors. She thought about the number 7 on the Indians' tank matching the 7 on her mother's forearm. She thought about a man named Dale Voss who knew about this garage and was coming for it. She reached into her jacket pocket and found her phone. She scrolled to the number Rex Gallagher had written at the bottom of his note in that large, deliberate handwriting. She pressed call. It rang twice. Rex said Gallagher. She said, I opened the garage. The garage. A pause, then how bad is it? She looked at the trophies on the wall. She looked at the Indian in the center of the room. She looked at the letter in her hand. Oh, it is not bad, she said. She took a breath. But I need to tell you something, and then I think I need your help. He did not ask what kind of help. He said, I will be there in 40 minutes. He said it the way a man says a thing when the decision was made long before this moment. She sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the workbench and the letter in her lap and waited. Through the open door of the garage, the morning sun had finally decided what it was going to do. It came low and gold across the scrubland and lit the clearing, and the Indian chief caught the edge of it, the red paint glowing deep as an ember. Casey looked at it for a long time. Then she put her hand to her chest where the chain had been and felt the absence of the key she had finally used. Rex Gallagher arrived in 38 minutes. Casey heard the Road King before she saw it, the deep idle coming up the dirt track and into the clearing. She stood in the doorway of the garage and watched him swing off the bike. He walked directly to the door without slowing and passed her into the garage like a man who had decided in advance not to waste time on the threshold. He went straight to the Indian. He did not look at the trophies first. He did not stand in the center of the room and take it all in. He crouched beside the engine cases and ran 2 fingers along the frame the way a doctor checks a pulse feeling for something specific. He stayed there for a long moment. Then he stood up and looked at Casey. He said, "Your mother never told anyone about this. It was not a question." Casey said, "Neither did I. Until now." She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the center of the garage with the fluorescent light overhead and the Indian between them. He read it once and then folded it carefully on the same creases Donna had made and handed it back. "Dale Voss," he said. "You know him," Casey said. Rex looked at the floor for a moment. "Dale Voss has been buying up land on the north end of Harlow for 3 years. He has already taken the old mill property and the Hendricks farm and 2 parcels out on Route 12. He paused. He has a county commissioner in his pocket, and he has been using environmental violation filings to force sales on properties he wants and cannot buy outright. Casey looked at him. "That is exactly what my mother warned me about." Rex nodded slowly. She was smarter than most people knew. It was not a compliment offered lightly. It was a statement of fact from a man who did not make statements lightly. Casey said there was something else. She moved the wooden box aside and looked at the workbench surface. There was a small brass ring flush with the wood easy to miss. She reached down and pulled it. The section of workbench lifted away hinged at the back. Underneath was a hollow space about 3 feet deep with a short wooden ladder going down into it. Cool cedar-scented air came up. Rex looked at the opening, then at Casey. She went down first. The space at the bottom was the size of a large closet. Solder-lined walls, tight-fitted boards, shelves on 3 sides, everything wrapped in oilcloth and labeled in her mother's block letters on paper tags tied with twine. Casey unwrapped the nearest piece. A motorcycle framed the metal surface showing the hand-finishing marks of someone who had worked it with files rather than machines. She read the tag. 1948 Crocker big tank frame. Matching numbers. 1 of 11 known. She heard Rex's breath change above her. She looked up. He was crouched at the edge of the opening, looking down. "Keep going," he said quietly. She unwrapped the next one. An engine case complete, all matching hardware in a separate cloth bag tied to the main piece. She read the tag. 1952 Vincent Black Shadow engine. Original paint on cases, unrestored. Rex said something low that she did not fully catch. She did not need to hear the words to understand the tone. She moved along the shelves. A Henderson 4-tank, a Browse Superior gearbox, a complete set of Indian 4-cylinders still in factory wrapping paper, brown and brittle with age, but intact. There was a small ledger on the bottom shelf. She opened it. Her mother had cataloged every piece. Date acquired, amount paid, source, condition notes. In the last column, a penciled estimate in Donna's hand dated 2 years ago. Casey turned to the total at the bottom of the last page. She looked at it for a long time. She climbed back up. Rex helped her with one hand without being asked. She said the number out loud. Rex was quiet for a moment. He said, "That is a conservative estimate." Casey closed the trap door. She stood with her hand on the workbench and looked at the Indian in the center of the room and thought about her mother paying property tax on this building for 18 years out of a waitress's wages and a series of odd jobs in a small Montana town. 18 years of quiet, patient, deliberate work. She said she bought all of this herself. Rex said yes. Casey said she never told anyone. He said she told of a right person at the right time. He looked at Casey. "She is telling you now." Before Casey could answer, her phone rang. The number was local but not saved. She answered. The voice was smooth and measured, a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. He introduced himself as Dale Voss. He said he was sorry for her loss. He said he understood she had recently come into possession of a small parcel on Decker Road. He said he had an interest in the area and would like to discuss a purchase. He said the number $42,000. Casey looked at Rex. She said to the phone, "How did you get this number?" Voss said, "Small town, Miss Mercer." He said it pleasantly. She said, "I am not interested in selling." There was a brief silence. He said, "I understand. These decisions take time. I will be in touch." He hung up. Rex watched her put the phone away. He said, "How long before he comes in person?" She said, "My mother's letter said he would come." She did not say how long. Rex said, "Then we do not wait for him to set the terms." He pulled out his own phone. He made a call lasting 45 seconds. When he was done, he said, "I told them to come at first light tomorrow." He paused. "Is that all right?" Casey looked around the garage, at the trophies, at the photographs, at the Indian. She said yes. She spent the rest of the day in the garage reading the journal. Donna had started it in 1986, the year she bought her first competitive bike, on payments, working double shifts at a truck stop outside Billings. The early entries were short and practical. Notes about tire compounds and suspension settings and the names of riders she had beaten and the ones she had not yet beaten and what the difference had been. By 1988, the entries were longer. She had started winning consistently. She wrote about the way the other riders looked at her in the staging area, first with the dismissal they gave all the women, and then with something different, something that took time to recognize, because it was the same look men gave each other when the competition was real. The 1991 national qualifier entry was 3 pages long, Donna's handwriting fast in places where she could not write as quickly as she was thinking. She described the race through sensation rather than statistics. The weight of the bike through the first turn, the sound of the crowd changing when she came through the second sector and first, the finish line coming up, and the knowledge, absolute and physical, that she had won. The 1994 entries were different. Harold Voss was not mentioned by name until the 3rd entry that year. Before that, he was the man from the sanctioning board, then the commissioner, and then in an entry dated March of 1994, his full name written with a precision that told Casey her mother had stopped being afraid to write it down. She read about the appeal, the lawyer who told Donna the case was solid and then stopped returning calls. The last race Donna entered in September of 1994, which she was allowed to start and then disqualified from mid-race on a ruling that 3 other riders received no penalty for. And the final entry for that year, which was only 2 lines. "I am done fighting a rigged game. I am going to build something they cannot take. I am going to build it quietly, and I am going to build it for a long time, and I am going to leave it to Casey when she is ready for it." Casey closed the journal. She sat on the workbench in the quiet garage and held it in her lap and looked at the trophies on the wall and thought about Donna sitting on the porch in the evenings with her coffee, watching the hills, saying nothing. All those years of silence she had read as reserve, as privacy, as simply the kind of woman her mother was. The silence had been purpose. It had been patience. A woman building something in the dark for 30 years so her daughter would have something solid to stand on when the ground gave out. Casey stayed until dark. She drove back to the Highline Motel. She lay on the bed and did not sleep much. At 5:40 in the morning, she heard the first engine. By the time she drove out to Decker Road, there were already 11 bikes in the clearing. Rex was there leaning against his Road King with a coffee from somewhere, watching the others pull in. She parked and he handed her the coffee without a word, and she accepted it without a word, and they stood together and watched the clearing fill. By 7:30, there were 23 bikes. Men and women, most of them between 45 and 65, faces of people who had lived outdoors and worked with their hands and made choices about their lives that were not always the choices other people would have made. They wore the iron verdict patch. They were quiet. They looked at the garage and waited. Rex said, "You should show them." She opened the garage. She watched them go in one by one. She watched their faces move through the stages, the trophies first, then the photographs, then the Indian in the center of the room. She watched each person go quiet in their own time as the weight of what they were looking at became clear. There was a woman in the group older than the others, with silver hair cut straight across and the posture of someone who had spent decades on a bike. She stood in front of the Indian for a long time, Then she turned to Casey. Her name was June Bishop. She was 67 years old and had ridden the same AMA regional circuit as Donna from 1988 to 1993. She said she had not seen this bike since the winter of 1993 when Donna had trailered it up from Billings and told June she was putting it away for a while. Casey said, "Did you ever ask her about it again?" June looked at the Indian and was quiet for a moment. She said, "I asked her once in 1995 where it had gone. Donna said she had sold it. She looked me in the eye and said it like it was the simplest thing in the world." She paused. I believed her for 30 years. Casey said she told me she had not left me with nothing. 3 weeks before she died. June said Donna Mercer never talked about money in her life. She looked at the trophies on the wall. She was talking about this. Then June said she had kept a copy. Casey said a copy of what? June said the original race results from the 1991 National Qualifier. Official timing data, 3 witnesses' signatures confirming Donna's finishing position. A copy of the original rulebook showing the disqualification provision Voss used did not exist in the version in effect on race day. She paused. I kept it in a fireproof box in my basement for 32 years because I knew someday someone was going to need it. Casey looked at her. June said, "Where do you want it?" That was when the cars came up the dirt track. 2 of them black and new, the kind that signal the person inside does not have to worry about cost. They pulled into the clearing and stopped. The men in the clearing stepped back slowly without being directed, giving room but not leaving it. Dale Voss got out of the first car. He was 60 years old, broad and settled, with the look of a man who had never needed to be physically imposing because money had always done it for him. His jacket was too nice for a dirt road in October, and his shoes were ruined before he reached the concrete pad. He had 2 men with him, one in a suit carrying a leather portfolio, the other in a county deputy's uniform, that Casey recognized as belonging to a man named Carl Britton, who had been writing selective tickets in this county for 12 years. Voss looked at the bikes in the clearing. He looked at the men and women standing among them. Then his gaze moved to the open garage door, to the Indian visible in the morning light, and something shifted in his face in a way he could not control fast enough. Every person in that clearing saw it. Rex saw it. June saw it. The road captain with the white beard standing at the edge of the group saw it. Voss had just shown them exactly what he wanted, which meant he had just revealed exactly what they were protecting. The clearing went very still. 23 people not moving, not speaking, simply present and watching. Voss recovered his expression and smiled. The smile was practiced and cost him nothing. He said, "Miss Mercer." He looked around the clearing once more with the careful neutrality of a man pretending he had not just made a mistake. "I wonder if we might speak privately." Casey said, "Anything you need to say to me, you can say here." Voss looked at the deputy. The deputy was studying his boots. Voss produced a folded document from his jacket and set it on the hood of his car. He said that is a county environmental assessment order filed yesterday. Concerns about soil contamination from prior mechanical use. Until the assessment is complete, the county has authority to restrict access and use of the structure. He paused. "I have spoken with the county commissioner, and the timeline for resolution is somewhat open-ended. I would hate to see you caught in a lengthy legal process, Miss Mercer. My offer still stands. I have raised it to $50,000. Cash. Today." The clearing was silent. Casey looked at the document. She looked at Voss. She looked at Deputy Britton, who had still not raised his eyes from his boots. "She said your father filed a fraudulent disqualification against my mother in 1994. He used his position on the sanctioning board to destroy her career because she was beating his riders and he could not stop her any other way." She paused. "You have been looking for this garage since he died because you know what is in it and you know what it proves." She paused again. "You filed a fraudulent environmental order yesterday using a county commissioner you have been funding since 2019. And you came here today believing that because I am alone and recently unemployed and currently without a permanent address, I would take whatever number you put in front of me." Voss had stopped smiling. Casey said, "I want you to look around this clearing one more time." He looked. 23 Iron Verdict members looked back at him. Not one of them moved, not one of them spoke. They simply stood solid and still in the particular silence of people who have already made their decision and are no longer debating it. Casey said, And I want you to know that June Bishop has had the original 1991 race results and documentation in a fireproof box in her basement for 32 years, and she drove here this morning to give it to me. Something moved across Voss's face that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. The man with the portfolio spoke quietly to Voss. Voss held up a hand without looking at him. He said, Miss Mercer, this does not have to be adversarial. She said you made it adversarial when you sent a deputy out here with a fraudulent court order. She picked the document up from the hood of his car and held it out to him. Get off my property. Voss took the document. He stood there holding it, the smile entirely gone, looking at Casey with the expression of a man who has walked through a door, expecting one room and found a completely different one. Rex Gallagher stepped forward. He said nothing. He simply moved from where he had been standing and stopped 4 feet from Voss and stood there with his arms at his sides. Nothing aggressive in the posture, nothing that could be called a threat, just the physical fact of a very large man who had decided to occupy a specific piece of ground and was not going to be moved from it. Deputy Britton said Mr. Voss quietly. Voss turned and walked back to his car. The two cars reversed down the dirt track. The sound of the engines faded and then disappeared around the bend, and the clearing was quiet again except for the wind through the scrub land and the sound of 23 people exhaling at roughly the same moment. June Bishop said behind Casey, well, that is how it starts. Casey turned to her. She said, what do you mean? June said men like Dale Voss do not leave after the first no. She said it without alarm, the way you state something about weather. They come back with better paperwork. Rex said, then we make sure the paperwork does not matter by the time he comes back. He looked at Casey. The story of what is in this garage and who your mother was needs to be known before Voss can frame it as anything else. Once it is public, a fraudulent environmental order on a property containing documented national-level motorcycle racing history becomes a very different kind of news story. Casey thought about that. She said, I do not know any journalists. Rex said June does. June Bishop looked at the ceiling of the garage in the manner of someone who had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it before she arrived. She said, I know a woman at the Billings AP Bureau. She has been doing a series on women in motorsports history. She paused. I sent her a message at 6 this morning. Casey said, when can you call her? June looked at her phone. She said she has already replied. The journalist arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Her name was Patricia Wynn. She was 45 years old and she had driven 3 hours because a source she trusted had told her it was worth it. She stood in the doorway of the garage for a long moment before she stepped fully inside. She spent 40 minutes looking at everything before she said a word. Then she said, why has no one written about this woman? Casey said someone worked very hard to make sure they did not. Patricia Wynn looked at the trophies. She looked at the Indian. She looked at June Bishop standing by the workbench with her arms crossed. And then she looked at Casey with the focused attention of a journalist who has just understood the shape of something important. She said, tell me everything. Casey told her everything. The journal, the 1991 win, the 1994 disqualification, and Harold Voss and the fraudulent provision, and the appeal that went nowhere. The garage and what it contained, the Indian and the hidden cellar, and the collection her mother had been quietly assembling for 3 decades. Dale Voss arriving that morning with a deputy and a fraudulent environmental order and an offer of $50,000. The key around her neck and the letter and the instruction to wait. Patricia took notes. She did not use a recorder. Her handwriting was fast and certain, and she did not ask Casey to slow down. When Casey finished, Patricia asked if she could photograph the trophies, the Indian and June's documentation. Casey said yes. Patricia spent another hour in the garage moving carefully, photographing everything. At 4:30, she sat outside the garage door and called her editor. Casey could hear one side of the conversation from 10 feet away. It was short. When Patricia hung up, she looked at Casey and said, we are running this. She said it with the certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than making a prediction. Casey said, how soon? Patricia said, Friday morning. She looked at her notes. I am also reaching out to the AMA Historical Committee and the Motorcycle Hall of Fame. What your mother documented here is not a local story, Miss Mercer. This is a story about a woman who was the best in the country at something and was deliberately erased by someone who found her inconvenient. She paused. Those stories do not stay local. After Patricia left, the clearing was quieter. Some riders had gone those with jobs to return to. 14 remained as the afternoon moved toward evening. June sat beside Casey on the concrete pad, and they did not talk much. The sun dropped behind the hills and the temperature fell the way it does in October in Montana decisively, as if the cold has been waiting for an opening and takes it the moment the light goes. June said your mother talked about you. Casey said, what did she say? June said she said you gave up everything to take care of her, and she never found the right words to tell you what it meant. She paused. She said she was building the garage to say it instead because Mercer women are better with things than with words. Casey looked at the hills. She said she was right about that. June said she also said you were the best thing she ever did. She said it the same way she said everything quietly and only once. But she said it. Casey did not answer for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and found the chain folded small, the key, cold and solid against her fingers. She held it in her palm. She thought about her mother driving up this dirt road alone for 18 years, unlocking this door, coming in here to this cold concrete building and working on these pieces by herself, cataloging everything, protecting everything, building something in the dark that she believed her daughter would one day need. Not for Casey to escape with, for Casey to stand on. Something shifted in her chest, not grief, not anger, something older and steadier, the feeling of ground under your feet after a long time of nothing solid. She closed her hand around the chain. She said, we need to talk about what happens next. Rex walked over from where he had been standing by his bike. He crouched on the concrete pad a few feet away, forearms on his knees, and waited. She said, Voss is going to come back with better paperwork like June said. He is going to try to use the county process, and he is going to use the fact that I have no permanent address and no income and no attorney to wear me down before the article runs. Rex said we can address the attorney. She said I also need to talk about the seller. She looked at him steadily. You know what is down there. You know what it is worth. She paused. I am not going to use it to run. I am not going to take the money and disappear. My mother did not build this so I could cash it out. She built it so I would have somewhere to stand from. Rex looked at her for a moment. He said, I know that. She said, so the money from those pieces goes into lawyers and property costs and whatever it takes to make this land untouchable. And then what is left goes into making this building what it should be, June said. And what should it be? Casey looked at the open garage door at the Indian, visible in the last of the light at the trophies on the wall. She said it should be what my mother would have built if Harold Voss had not stolen 30 years of her life. She stood up and walked to the edge of the clearing and called Howard Briggs, who answered on the fourth ring with the wariness of a man whose evening was about to be interrupted. She told him she needed a property attorney who was not afraid of a county commissioner with a development company behind him. She told him she had documentation of a fraudulent environmental order and a 30-year-old fraudulent disqualification and a collection of assets that would pay for whatever he needed to charge. Howard Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know someone. I will make a call tonight. She thanked him and put the phone away. She stood at the edge of the clearing in the October dark and looked up at the sky which had cleared and was showing stars now cold and very bright, the kind of sky that appears in rural Montana when there is no competing light for 50 miles in any direction. Behind her in the garage, the Indian chief sat in the dark, 63 years old and untouched by time because someone had loved it enough to keep it safe and someone else had been patient enough to wait. She turned and walked back to the clearing. Patricia Wynn's article ran on Friday morning at 6:47. Casey was awake when the notification came through, sitting at the table in the Highline Motel with the bad machine coffee and her phone face up. She read it once and then again more slowly. Patricia had written it with the precision of someone who understood that the facts themselves, arranged correctly, were more devastating than any editorial opinion layered on top of them. The headline was straightforward. The subheadline was not. It named Harold Voss. It named Dale Voss by name and company and current commissioner relationship. It named the 1991 national qualifier, the timing data, the rulebook discrepancy, the fraudulent disqualification. It named the Indian chief and what it was worth and where it had been sitting. And it named Donna Mercer, fully, accurately, as the best woman dirt track racer in the AMA regional circuit for 3 consecutive seasons, deliberately removed from the record by a man who found her inconvenient, whose son was currently attempting to acquire the property on which the evidence of that erasure had been preserved for 3 decades. By 8 in the morning, the article had been shared 4,000 times. By 10, it was 11,000. Casey drove out to Decker Road and opened the garage and sat inside it with the journal and let the morning happen. Paul Weaver arrived at 9:30 with Rex and June. Howard Briggs had made his call. Paul Weaver was 61 years old, drove a truck older than Casey's, and had spent 20 years doing property and civil rights law in rural Montana, with the focused energy of a man who had found his specific purpose. He walked into the garage, looked at the trophies on the wall. For 15 seconds, looked at Casey and said, "I read the article on the drive down. Tell me about the environmental order." She told him. She sent him the photograph she had taken of the document. He looked at it and said this was filed on a Wednesday. The county environmental office does not process new rural assessments on Wednesdays because the assessor who handles them is in Helena every Wednesday for a standing state committee meeting. He has done that for 9 years. He paused, which means this order was filed by someone without authority to file it, or the date on it is not the actual filing date. Either way, it has a problem. Casey said, "Can you get it dismissed?" He said, "I can get it stayed within 48 hours, which functionally means the same thing." He opened his laptop. More importantly, once I filed the stay motion and attached the timeline inconsistency, the county commissioner who approved this order is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the county attorney because his name is on the approval, and the approval does not hold. He began typing. The calls started coming in before noon. The Motorcycle Hall of Fame in Sturgis, a curator who had read the article and wanted to discuss Donna Mercer's induction candidacy. An auction specialist from Denver who said 3 separate clients had forwarded him the article before 8 in the morning. A journalist from a national motorcycle magazine. A woman from Billings who had raced against Donna in 1990 and had been waiting 20 years for someone to tell the truth about what Harold Voss had done to the women's circuit. Rex handled the calls Casey did not want to take. He did it without being asked, by observing what was needed in doing it. The call Casey took herself came at 2:15, a federal area code, an FBI agent from the Helena field office. He said they had received the article that morning and that it had been forwarded internally because they had an existing investigation into County Commissioner Gerald Parks and his relationship with Voss Development Group. He said the environmental order filing was potentially relevant to that investigation. He said he would like to send someone to speak with her. She said tomorrow morning. He said we will be there. She put her phone away and walked back into the garage and stood in front of the Indian chief. This was the moment she had been moving toward without knowing it for 3 days, and before that for 3 months, and before that for 8 years of double shifts and chemotherapy drives and a heater that would not work. And before all of that for the whole of her life in a small town with a mother who watched the hills in the evenings and kept her past in a locked building on a dirt road and never once complained about what had been taken from her. She stood in front of the motorcycle and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Her mother had been 28 years old when she won the 1991 national qualifier, 2 years younger than Casey was now. She had been the best provably and absolutely, and a man with connections had reached out and pushed her off that edge because he could and because nobody had stopped him. And Donna Mercer had gotten up. She had not gone back to racing. She had not spent her life in public bitterness. She had gotten up and done something harder, which was to build quietly, to preserve carefully, to work and wait and trust that the right moment would come, even if she did not live to see it. Casey put her hand on the Indian's tank. The red paint was cool under her palm. She thought about what her mother had written. The Indian stays. She is not a thing to be sold. She is who I was. She is who you come from. The Denver auction specialist had asked about the Indian specifically. The Hall of Fame curator had asked whether it would be part of any donation arrangement. Patricia Wynn had described it in the article as potentially the most significant surviving example of pre-war American motorcycle competition history. People who knew what it was worth had been asking about it all day. Casey stood with her hand on the tank and thought about her mother driving up this dirt road alone, unlocking this door, coming in here to sit with this bike in the cold and the quiet, the way you stay with something you love that the world is not yet ready to see. She sat down on the concrete floor beside the Indian. Not on a bench, not at a distance. On the floor, close the way she had sat in the chair beside her mother's bed in those last weeks, near enough to reach out if a reaching out became necessary. She looked at the number 7 on the tank. She looked at the chrome that had not dulled because someone had protected it from everything that dulls things. She said out loud to the sealed air of the garage, to the trophies on the wall, and the photographs in the 30 years of careful, quiet work, "I understand now, Mom. I understand what you were keeping it for. It was not worth $500,000. It was worth 30 years of getting up in the morning and driving up a dirt road alone and working in the cold and trusting that somewhere down the line there would be a daughter standing in this garage who needed to understand where she came from. No dollar amount covered that. No auction house had a category for it." Casey put her hand on the tank one more time. She said she stays. She stood up and turned and walked to the door of the garage. Rex was outside near his bike. She said to him, "The Indian is not for sale. Not to the auction house. Not to the Hall of Fame. Not to anyone. She stays here." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, the same single nod he had given her across the church on the day of the funeral, and she understood that he had expected her to say exactly that. The conversation with the Denver auction specialist took 20 minutes. Casey listed the seller items from memory and the ledger. When she mentioned the Vincent Black Shadow engine, the specialist made a sound that was not quite a word. When she finished, he gave his honest assessment of each piece, which matched her mother's penciled estimates closely enough to confirm that Donna Mercer had known exactly what she had. Casey said, "I want to discuss consignment for all the seller pieces, except the Indian. I also want to discuss restoration partnerships for pieces that need work, because I intend to do some of that work myself in this facility." He said, "You restore motorcycles." She said, "I grew up watching my mother do it, and I have been doing it myself since I was 16. She paused. "I am also going to be hiring." Paul Weaver filed the stay motion on the environmental order at 4:15 that afternoon. 14 pages. The timeline inconsistency occupied 3 of them. At 5:42, a text from an unknown number, "Commissioner Parks has retained counsel," signed with initials Casey did not recognize. She showed it to Rex. He said, "That means the order is already dead. Men who file fraudulent documents do not retain personal counsel unless the document is about to become their personal problem." She said, "Who sent this?" He said, "Someone who wanted you to know. There are people in this county who have been waiting for something to crack open what Parks and Voss have been running for a long time." He looked at the garage. This cracked it open. The FBI agent arrived the next morning at 9. He was younger than Casey expected, mid-30s, with the careful manner of a man who understood he was in a room with people who had reason to be skeptical of authority and was not going to waste their time pretending otherwise. He interviewed Casey for 90 minutes, June Bishop for 45. He reviewed Paul Weaver's motion and the photograph of the environmental order. He looked at the garage and the trophies and the Indian and did not say much about any of it except to note the case number he was assigning. Before he left, he said, "The investigation I mentioned has been open for 14 months. The material you have provided today is relevant and helpful." He paused. "I would encourage you to maintain secure copies of all documentation." She said, "I have 3 copies in 3 separate locations." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Good." He nodded at Rex on his way to his car, the nod of men who have been aware of each other from a distance for some time and arrived at a mutual understanding, and then he drove back down the dirt road. Rex watched him go. He said, 14 months. Casey said, meaning they were building the case before we handed them anything. Rex said, meaning Voss is already in trouble and does not know how much. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, Dale Voss was escorted from the Voss Development Group building on Commerce Street by 2 FBI agents and a county deputy who was not Carl Britton. Britton had submitted his resignation the previous week and moved to his sister's place in Idaho. Casey was in the garage when it happened. She heard about it from Rex, who heard it from 3 people within 20 minutes because Harlow was a small town, and this was not the kind of event that stayed private. She put her phone down. She looked at the Indian. She said, "That is for you, Mom." She said it quietly once and meant it entirely. The application to the Motorcycle Hall of Fame took 6 weeks to prepare. June Bishop wrote half of it from memory. Patricia Wynn contributed a formal letter of support and attached her article and its follow-up pieces, which had together been shared more than 80,000 times. The Denver specialist provided a written assessment of the collection's historical significance. 3 former riders from the AMA regional circuit who had raced against Donna each sent signed statements. In December, the Hall of Fame notified Casey that Donna Mercer had been approved for induction in the upcoming class. Casey read the letter in the garage, sitting on the workbench with the Indian in front of her, and the trophies on the wall, and the winter light coming in through the open door at a low angle that made everything in the room look made of the same warm material. She called June Bishop. June picked up on the second ring. Casey said she got in. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, of course she did. They stayed on the line for a little while without speaking, and neither of them needed to explain why. Then June said, what are you going to wear to the ceremony? Casey laughed. It came from somewhere below the sternum, real and unexpected, and it surprised her with its own realness. She said, I was thinking the jacket. June said yes. Wear the jacket. The renovation of the garage took 4 months. A contractor named Ellis Ford, who had grown up in Harlow and whose grandmother had known Donna since the 80s, came out to look at the job, walked through twice, and said he would do the roof and lighting and interior work at cost because some projects were not about the money. The cellar was cleaned out and fitted with climate control and better shelving and a cedar floor that Casey laid herself over 2 weekends with help from Rex and a man named Wade Armstrong from Iron Verdict, who was the chapter's carpenter and brought his own tools and accepted payment in nothing but coffee. The collection from the cellar went to auction through Denver in 2 separate sales. The first covered Paul Weaver's fees, the property cost, Casey's debt, and the renovation budget with a remainder. The second sale produced a number that made the specialist's voice go careful in the way voices go careful when something exceeds all projections. Casey deposited it and sat with it for a week before she touched it. Then she made a list. It was not long. It was the list of a woman who had learned from her mother how to build things that last by being patient and not trying to do everything at once. Brett Holden had closed the Silver Spoon in November. He had let it run down through the fall, stopped at paying suppliers reliably, let the remaining staff go, and finally locked the doors on a Tuesday without notice. A padlock on the door and a bank notice in the window, and a for-lease sign that had been there for 6 weeks. Casey called the number on the sign. The lease negotiation took 2 weeks. Casey brought Paul Weaver. The bank representative had clearly read the AP article because he recognized her name immediately, and his manner shifted accordingly. The terms were what Paul Weaver proposed, not what the bank originally offered, and the bank accepted them. On the first day of March, Casey Mercer put a key in the lock of the Silver Spoon Diner on Main Street in Harlow, Montana, and opened the door. The interior smelled like old coffee and the staleness of a space closed through a Montana winter. The linoleum was scuffed, and Brett Holden had taken the commercial espresso machine when he left, which Paul Weaver was addressing separately. Casey stood in the middle of the diner floor and looked at the empty space. She thought about 11 years of walking this floor with a coffee pot. She thought about the Henderson family in the corner booth on Thursday evenings. She thought about old Pete Sallow at the counter with his crossword. She thought about the woman at table 4, with the purse held closed with a safety pin, eating her soup carefully, while a room full of people pretended not to notice what was happening. She walked behind the counter. She turned on all the lights. The diner filled with light. She opened the back door and stood in the alley for a moment. The same alley, the same concrete step where she had sat on October 21st with a useless key in her hand and $91 and no clear idea of what came next. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to work. The Silver Spoon reopened in April. The renovation was modest. Casey kept the bones of the place because the bones were what mattered. She put the old photographs back on the walls, the ones the original family had stored in boxes in the back when Brett Holden removed them. Actual photographs of actual Harlow. Actual people. Actual history. She added one new photograph. It hung behind the counter in the center position, framed in plain wood. Donna Mercer at the 1991 National Qualifier, goggles up, grinning the trophy in both hands, the crowd behind her going blurred with motion. Underneath it, on a small card in its own frame, the year and the event and the name, Donna Mercer, National Qualifier Champion, 1991. The Henderson family came back on the first Thursday. Old Pete Sallow came back on the first Monday. He sat at the counter and put his crossword on the surface and asked for decaf without looking up the way he had been asking for 22 years. And Casey brought it to him, and he said thank you, and they both understood that some things pick up where they left off as though nothing interrupted them. June Bishop came in for breakfast every Saturday morning. She sat at the counter and talked to whoever was there, and sometimes she brought things, photographs she had found in boxes in her own garage, that she thought should be in the collection at Decker Road. One Saturday in May, she brought a photograph from a race in 1989. Two riders in the staging area, helmets off, talking. One of them was Donna, 26 years old, laughing at something the other woman had just said, her head thrown back, entirely unguarded, entirely herself. Casey had never seen her mother laugh like that in a photograph. She put it behind the counter next to the 1991 qualifier. June watched her do it and drank her coffee and said nothing, which was exactly right. Howard Briggs, the estate lawyer, had a grandnephew named Cooper, which Casey learned because Howard mentioned it apologetically when he called to ask if the boy could come by. Cooper Briggs was 17 years old and had been circling the Decker Road property on his bicycle for 3 weeks before Casey walked to the edge of the clearing one afternoon and said, "You have been out here 6 times. Either come in or stop coming." He came in. He said almost nothing the first 2 weeks. He watched everything. He asked precise questions when he asked anything at all. He had hands that understood what they were touching in the way some people's hands do, a spatial intelligence about machinery that could not be taught but could be developed if the foundation was there. Casey let him stay. By July, there were 4 motorcycles in the workshop at various stages of restoration. The work was not fast. Casey did not want it fast. She wanted it done correctly, which was the same standard her mother had applied when she laid out those carburetor tools on a clean cloth in a specific order in a garage she had sealed for 18 years and trusted would hold. She had a second apprentice by June, a 20-year-old woman named Sadie Flynn from Roundup, who had been working at an auto shop for 2 years and had sent Casey a paper letter after reading the AP article asking if there was any chance of a position. 3 paragraphs, technically precise, demonstrating more mechanical intuition than most people Casey had worked alongside in 11 years. Casey called her the same day she got the letter. Some things deserve the weight of a real response. The Decker Road property received its sign in May, hand-lettered by a woman named Rita Blackwood, who had done commercial sign work out of her garage on Elm Street for 30 years, the kind of lettering you could identify from a distance by the certainty of the line. The sign read Mercer Workshop, established 2025, underneath smaller American motorcycle restoration. Casey stood in the clearing and looked at it for a long time after Rita put it up. Rex was there. June was there. Wade Armstrong was there with his tools still in the truck because he had finished the last of the interior shelving that morning. Rex said your mother would say it is too small. Casey said she would say it is exactly the right size. He considered that. Then he said yes. That is probably right. The Hall of Fame induction ceremony was in Sturgis in August. Casey drove down with June in June's truck, 2 days there, the ceremony 2 days back. Rex and 4 members of Iron Verdict MC rode escort as far as the Wyoming state line and peeled off with a collective wave that Casey caught in the rearview mirror. The ceremony was formal and brief. There was a stage and a podium and a room full of people who cared about motorcycle history and understood what a 1991 National Qualifier Championship meant and what it meant that the woman who had won it had been removed from the record and that the record was now being corrected. The Hall of Fame curator read Donna Mercer's name into the official record. Casey stood at the podium to accept the induction plaque. She looked at the room. She said, "My mother built her legacy in private for 30 years because a man with connections decided she should not be allowed to have one in public." She paused. She built it anyway. She said it was for me, but I think it was also for every woman who was told that what she had earned was not hers to keep. She paused again. "I am accepting this on behalf of my mother. I am keeping the plaque in the garage she built because that is where it belongs. With everything else, she refused to let them take." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Casey drove back to Harlow with the plaque on the seat between her and June, wrapped in a cloth June had brought specifically for it. The road went north through Wyoming and into Montana, and the landscape opened the way it does when you cross into the state, the sky getting larger, the distances longer, the particular quality of light that makes everything look simultaneously farther away and more real. She drove out to Decker Road before she went anywhere else. She opened the garage and turned on the lights and stood inside for a moment, the plaque in her hands, looking at the wall of trophies and the photographs and the Indian in the center of the room. She put the plaque on the wall. She found a level in the tool chest and made sure it was straight. She stepped back. The plaque was the newest thing on the wall by 30 years. It sat among the old brass and silver trophies with their darkened plates, and it did not look out of place. It looked like what it was, the last piece of something that had been building for a very long time and was now complete. Casey stood there for a while. Then she went to the Indian. She had been working on it since March, going through it with the precision and patience her mother had used on every piece in the cellar, checking every component, addressing what needed addressing, leaving alone what did not, treating it as what it was finished and needing only care rather than transformation. It was ready, she had known for 2 weeks. She had been finding reasons to say it was not quite ready yet, one more afternoon, one more check, because ready meant something she needed to be certain of before she arrived at it. She stood beside it now and stopped making reasons. She reached into her jacket pocket and found the chain folded small, the brass key cold against her fingers, as it had been every day since she took it from around her neck and used it on the morning of October 22nd. She held the key in her palm and looked at it. Then she put it in her pocket and got her helmet and her gloves from the workbench and zipped up the jacket with its patches. The iron verdict patches Rex had placed there quietly one afternoon in May without announcement. The Hall of Fame patches that had arrived in the mail, the patches that had been her mother's and the patches that were hers, and the line between them was becoming harder to see, which was exactly as it should be. She wheeled the Indian to the door of the garage. She stood in the doorway and looked out at the Montana night. The stars overhead, the scrubland pale in the darkness, the dirt road leading back to the county highway, and from there to Harlow, and from there to wherever the road went. She kick-started the Indian on the second try. The engine caught. It sounded like an engine that had been waiting for the right moment in the right hands and had now arrived at both. Not a museum piece, not something preserved past the point of use. A motorcycle running ready with somewhere to go. She sat on it for a moment. She felt the weight of it under her, the balance, the particular way this specific machine felt beneath a person who was built to ride it. She pulled on her helmet. She pulled on her gloves. She rode out of the clearing and down the dirt track and turned north onto the county road, the headlight cutting clean through the August dark, the engine steady and unhurried below her. She rode for an hour. She rode through the dark on a machine that had earned its place in the world the hard way, covering the roads of rural Montana, the way her mother had covered them, and her mother's mother before that, the kind of riding that is not about speed or performance, but about being exactly where you are and nothing else. She turned around at the place where the road crested the last hill before the county line. On a clear night, you could see the lights of Harlow spread small and certain in the valley below. She stopped. She let the engine idle. She looked at the lights of the town. She thought about her mother on the porch on Calvert Street, watching the hills in the evenings with her coffee all those years. Not watching the hills she understood now, watching the direction of Decker Road, watching the direction of the things she had built and was building and had built the things she was leaving for her daughter to find when her daughter was finally ready. I did not leave you with nothing. Casey sat on the Indian Chief on the hilltop above Harlow in the August dark and felt the engine turning under her and the night air on her face and the weight of the jacket on her shoulders. No, she thought, you did not. She rode back down into town. She parked the Indian in the garage and locked the door and stood outside for a moment in the quiet. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the chain and the key. She held it in her open palm. The brass was warm now from the ride, warm from the night, warm in a way that felt different from every other time she had held it. She stood with it for a long moment and let all of them move through her at once. June with her fireproof box and 32 years of patience. Rex paying for 2 coffees every Thursday for 6 years without once saying why. Cooper in the workshop learning to listen to what an engine was telling him. Sadie, who wrote a paper letter because she understood that some things deserve the weight of a stamp and the time it took to send one. And her mother, 28 years old, trophy in both hands, the crowd behind her going loud before any of it was taken, before any of it had to be rebuilt. Casey looked at the key one last time. She looked up at the sign above the garage door. Mercer Workshop. The letters certain and unhurried in Rita Blackwood's hand, visible even in the dark. She put the chain back around her neck. She was not ready to pass it on yet. There was still work to do, and that was not a burden. That was the shape of a life that was going somewhere. She had been going somewhere from the moment she stood in a diner in Harlow, Montana, and untied her apron and set it on the counter, and walked out into the October night toward whatever the road held next. She turned and walked to her truck. She drove home to the small house at the bottom of the dirt road she had bought in February, the one with the porch that looked up the hill toward the garage. She parked. She got out. She stood on the porch and looked up at the hill where the sign was in shadow, but she knew what it said. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table and thought about what she was going to build next. And for the first time in a very long time, maybe for the first time ever, the future was not obscured by the present. It was just the future, wide and unwritten and entirely hers.